much. Now, here's an attractive couple, Gail Farrell from Durant, Oklahoma, Dick Dale from Algona, Iowa. Excuse me. Let's listen to Gail and Dale and one of the newer songs.
One toke over the line, sweet Jesus, one toke over the line. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. Waiting for the train that goes home, sweet Mary, hoping that the train is on time. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. Who do you love? I hope it's me. I've been changing, as you can plainly see. I felt the joy and I learned about the pain that my mama said. If I should choose to make a part of me, would surely strike me dead. And now I'm one toke over the line, sweet Jesus, one toke over the line. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. Waiting for the train that goes home, sweet Mary, hoping that the train is on time. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. One toke over the line, sweet Jesus, one toke over the line. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. Don't you know that we're waiting for the train that goes home, sweet Mary, hoping that the train is on time. Sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line. Don't you know that we're sitting downtown in a railway station, one toke over the line.
And there you heard a modern spiritual by Gail and Dale.
Wow, we were just having a great sing-along here at Darkwood Brew. Hi, welcome to Darkwood Brew. I'm Eric Elnes, your host, and Darkwood Brew is that place where we combine ancient Christian mystical practice with modern interactive web technology, world-class jazz, arts, biblical scholarship, and, well, you never know what's going to be playing on the show open, do you? In 2004, a group of clergy based in Phoenix, Arizona, felt that Christianity had gone not just one, but several tokes over the line, emphasizing a select list of highly dubious personal moral virtues while overlooking an entire raft of systemic evils that were leading to widespread poverty and also glorifying a God who seemed to know nothing about loving one's enemies. In response, they gathered with clergy, lay people, biblical scholars, and theologians from around the world, around the country, and across theological lines to draft a list of 12 principles, not of objection to their brothers and sister Christians, but rather their joys, the joys of what it meant to be follow a more progressive understanding of Christian faith. That list became known as the Phoenix Affirmations. This particular series is actually based and inspired by one of those affirmations, Affirmation 7, which reads that Christian love of neighbor includes preserving religious freedom and the church's ability to speak prophetically to government by resisting the commingling of church and state. That particular affirmation was inspired by two sources. The first was the Barmen Declaration, a declaration that came out of Nazi Germany in 1934 after Hitler took over the Christian church, and most Christian churches went along for the ride. But there was a select group of some of the greatest theologians of the 20th century who gathered hastily in Barmen, Germany, and stayed up all night with drinking black coffee and smoking a lot of cigars, and came out with the Barmen Declaration, 6 points that countered the Nazi takeover of the church and countered and encouraged resistance. One of those points was resisting the commingling of church and state. The other inspiration for Affirmation 7 of the Phoenix Affirmation was the prophet Amos, the subject of our series. So joining us this evening, as has been in the past for the series, is Frank Schaeffer, author and speaker. He'll be here to help us kind of discern what Amos is getting at in chapter 7 tonight, and particularly issues of systemic injustice and so the separation of church and state. But before we go any further, let's take a look at what has happened so far in the series. While many experienced amazing economic prosperity, the rich getting richer and the middle class even entering the rich class, the poor got poorer. I'm speaking, of course, of 8th century Israel in the 8th century BCE. As one person long ago observed, calling Amos a shepherd is a bit like calling Jimmy Carter a peanut farmer.
I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions.
To think about ways that the connections that we have can make us be the church. So we don't go to church, but that we become the church. And we find those ways through convergence to connect with people of different churches, people of different faiths.
Sincerity is the most overrated virtue. You know, we tend to feel that if people are sincere about their beliefs, oh, well, that's his personal belief, that's her personal belief, they're very sincere people, that kind of lets everybody off the hook.
Picture, for instance, the minimum wage, and picture a time when the minimum wage could have provided a sustainable level of wealth for a person to get by anyway, and then prices raise rapidly, but the minimum wage is still stuck back at where it was, a decade before prices rose, and people say, well, we're paying the going rate, what's the problem?
One of the great sad things of our own age is that the prophetic voices say on the environment, oh, that's a left-wing issue, so now all Republicans have to pretend there's not global warming. Human trafficking, oh, the evangelicals are upset about it because it's part of the sex industry. That must just be more prudish right-wingers. No, it's not. It's compassionate people you may not agree with politically or go to church with. You and I and this program and other people of goodwill have to find a way to put a moral compass back on the American discourse, free from the culture war spin.
The way that I see Amos is the way that I tend to see the prophets generally. They, of course, are each distinctive, but I think one of the grounding things about a prophet is that the prophet will never allow God's story to be put in a larger story. I put larger in quotes there, meaning by that for the prophet, God's story is always the ultimate, the overarching, the encompassing story of the world. So that when I think about Amos and, say, American religion today, I think about the way in which the prophet would press us to make sure that God's story is the overarching story and America's story occurs within that, not above it, not greater than. When America's story, or American religion, becomes more important than God's story, for the prophets, that's idolatry. You see, one of the things about middle-class religion, and I don't want people to think I'm talking about them. I am one of those. I'm talking about us. One of the problems with middle-class religion is that it can be a way of obtaining comfort. It can be turned inward, so it's primarily subjective. That is, it makes our innards feel good. It can be a way of escaping the ways in which, and I think typically unintentional, but the ways in which our actions in the workaday world really violate people we never see. Peter's story, for example, says that Americans are a great-hearted and a generous people. At the same time, he says, one of our biggest problems, that is, as Americans, is we let our institutions sin for us. Meaning by that by living the comfortable life, we may not always be aware of what is going on that gives us privilege that at the same time, in the language of the prophets, really does grind the face of the poor.
That was Tex Sample, who did an interview on the prophet Amos with Eric, how long ago?
About 10 years ago, I think, actually, yeah.
It's good clips that were found and used today in worship, and very helpful, I think, in our discussion today, especially when we're going to start off with our Pneuma reading from Amos in the 7th chapter, verses 7 through 13. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there, and prophesy there. But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is the temple of the kingdom.
Well, it's a lot of anger, I think, underneath that verse, huh? God envisioning basically Israel being wiped out because they are not measuring up. And there's that mention of a plumb line. Do you know what a plumb line is, anybody? Some people, when we were talking about this in our planning meeting, were wondering if a plumb line wasn't, that little string that's got blue chalk on it. You snap and it makes a straight line. But a plumb line is actually something that looks a bit like this. Actually, it doesn't have a little jar on the end. That's the closest we can come to a plumb bob, which is a weight. But it was a weight on the end of a cord. Then you could set a wall by. It was very important that a wall was not only straight, but it was perfectly vertical, especially in ancient times when a lot of the building materials weren't as rigid as they are today and were susceptible to caving in if they leaned a little bit, like a mud brick or a wall made out of rocks. If it leaned, it could cave and it could kill people. And Amos envisions,
very dangerous.
Yeah, Amos envisions God standing in the midst of Israel with the plumb line and finding that those walls are leaning mighty fall. Some of them are falling over. They need to be taken down entirely. And of course, he's not talking about actual walls, but rather the institutions of Israel.
And Tex Sample in his opening comments talk about how we as Americans sometimes let the institutions sin for us.
Yeah, that was
brilliant line.
That was a great line. He's quoting Peter's story by it. But yeah, isn't it interesting how easy it is to kind of allow certain, if we can buy shoes cheaply and clothing and other goods and services, when we might even have a vague awareness in the back of our minds that not everyone who's producing those is being treated fairly. It's just kind of easy to kind of let something that's happening abroad, do the sinning for us, so we can get our cheap goods, for instance.
And often we don't even know it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of the nature of systemic evil, which is really the focus in all of Amos. It's not so much aimed at individuals, but systems. And the problem with systems is, I mean, we all rely on them. I mean, if you purchase a cappuccino at a local coffee shop today, you likely, that cappuccino was reliant upon about 300 different relationships in order to bring you that single cappuccino. So we are really in a world that's full of systems, and systems help us prosper and flower and so forth. There's a cappuccino right there. but the problem is when the output of the system is negative, not a cappuccino, but perhaps injustice. Picture, for instance, Nazi Germany, a very good example. They created a whole lot of evil because the evil was systemic, which meant that if you zoomed in and looked at any particular person or activity in the chain, almost everything looked perfectly legitimate and good. Those gas chambers were created by people who were making tiles and people making shower heads and taken care of by accountants and so forth. It was just that end product was rather unfortunate. That's what systemic evil does. It's particularly dangerous because if you zoom in, almost every aspect of the chain is just simply good, hardworking people, just putting bread on the table. It's only when you pull back and see the whole, the forest for the trees, you discover that this is connected to something not so wonderful after all. And that not so wonderfulness is what God was finding in Israel in the 8th century, where the rich and middle class were getting richer and richer and richer. And actually, because of the way the money was being made, the poor were just getting poorer at the same time.
Yeah, there's I think the role of the prophet in today's culture is exactly the one who does step back and takes a look at that overall big picture. There's a group called The Story of Stuff, for instance, that does animate kind of video stuff about the process from creation all the way through distribution and everything else and recycling and all that kind of stuff. It's a 20-minute video, but it's a good watch because it helps us pull back and see from start to finish what happens with the goods and services that we have and how it's, not so great for the world and not so great for that polarization between the very, very rich and the very, very poor.
Interesting. Yeah, and a lot of time, part of the message of Amos being, I think, that the pain that the system was creating was greater than the pain it would take to actually bring that system down and kind of reboot it, in a sense. Oftentimes we react to the violence in Amos, and there's quite a bit. I mean, I personally react to that myself. In fact, there's a lot of violent passages in Scripture, and some of them clearly seem that they are the product of more our human nature rather than channeling something directly from God. But oftentimes if we rush past those passages, and in Amos we want to rush past a lot of it, talking about this wiping out of these people by a foreign power. But sometimes if we look behind what's going on, we have to ask ourselves, if there is a God who truly loves us beyond our wildest imagination, if we are part of a system, supporting a system that is producing great evil, does a loving God simply sit back and allow that system to go on when the very people that God loves beyond their wildest imagination are being crushed into the ground, as Amos says? The Scriptures continually talk about a God who's not passive in those situations, but not also vindictive. Amos shakes people up, but also in the history of Israel in the 8th century, you look at what actually transpired. It wasn't as if Amos was saying, you're going to be wiped out, and then they were wiped out the next day. But they were. Those 10 tribes of northern Israel that Amos was talking about, 40 years after he proclaimed his messages, they actually were wiped out, not by God, but by the Assyrians.
And even if we were to recognize some of those signs in our systems today, it seems so overwhelming. How do you change systems? How do you get involved in what's happening to actually make a difference? Even if those people of 8th century wanted to make a difference, where would they have stepped in? Yeah. So being able to look at the big picture also helps us see where I think some of that input that we can step in at any step of the way and do one or two things to help alleviate some of that overall stress within the system is a good thing to do.
Yeah, and it takes time. It takes patience, and think that's the heart of the message in Amos is really, it wasn't that God was going to destroy them, but their decision-making processes, if left unchecked, was going to lead 40 years later to some really bad, really stupid decisions that was going to draw the Assyrians down upon them. God is in a sense shaking them up early, saying, listen, you need to change the way your society is operating, and giving them the time. I mean, warning them well enough in advance so that there was time for people to put in that work and have that patience that could actually make a change for the better.
And that discernment of checking in with our systems to make sure that we're always reforming them, always changing them, instead of getting stuck in a pattern that doesn't allow us to change, or we're too afraid to change. Is kind of our calling, I think, from Amos as well.
Yeah. So what happened out in the blogs this week?
Well, in talking about systemic evil, I mean, one of the conversations we had last week was about how we are to treat people as if they are Jesus themselves, the recipients of our services or whatever. And Leslie Merle, who is one of our regular bloggers, wrote on that and said, what happens when the person you're treating like Jesus is not being like Jesus? And then how do you deal with that whole issue? I think what she's trying to ask is, she calls them the not Jesus. And she says, what do you do if they keep coming back and taking advantage of the fact that you're treating them like Jesus and giving them, everything without pay or whatever, all that kind of stuff? How do you keep people from becoming toxic, as she says? And to me, that's the question of how do you deal with evil in this situation? How does Amos deal with that systemic evil as well as the human tendency to turn inward and not everyone's treating everybody like Jesus? So what do we do with that?
Yeah, great. Get out
It's
in the
a good
blogs
question.
and check out Leslie's article. Yeah, great. Well, hey, we just want to mention a couple things before moving on. First of all, if you'd like to meet us personally, we'd love to meet you at the Wild Goose Festival this summer. They'll be taking place in Hot Springs, North Carolina, and would love to see you out there. Our Darkwood Brew will be managing actually a coffee house and also the Performance Cafe there, which will have kind of a constant stream of music and speakers. Frank Schaeffer actually will be joining me for a couple of Darkwood Brew unplugs there, as well as some other guests. So we'll be doing some Darkwood Brew happenings there at the Wild Goose. And
Hot Springs sounds terrible.
It is a beautiful place. I was there actually a couple months ago to walk the grounds with the organizers, and it's going to be great. It's right along a beautiful river in a spectacularly beautiful area of North Carolina. So hope you can join us. Get out to wildgoosefestival.org and pick up some tickets and come and see us. Well, Jorge, I would like to have you introduce the band before we move on to Frank Schaeffer.
Yes. We have Mr. Ron Cooley on guitar, Robert Bennett on the drums, Ricky Williams on the bass. My name is Jorge Nila. We're doing two tunes. One, Darkwood Blue by Chuck Baronic, and Blessed Are They by David Haas.
Those will be happening a little later in the program.
Later in the program.
Yeah. Well, now we're being joined once again by our friend Frank Schaeffer, who's joining us from the Eastern Seaboard himself. Frank, good to see you again.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And actually, you're not, I just simply mentioned that you're from the East because you're actually not coming to us from home, are you? You're in...
Yeah, no, I got back. I was in New York yesterday, but I got back today, and so, yep, I'm sitting back in Massachusetts.
Oh, there we go. I didn't actually see you on my screen. I see your artist studio and all that. So good. You've been doing a lot of painting these days, I know.
Yeah, back to painting. I have an easel sitting over here, and have been painting steadily. I finished a book I'd been working on for the last 2 years and painting a little bit while working, but now that I've put that away for a while and working on trying to get it published, and some editing on it, I've gotten into the painting what's in my garden. During the spring, it's a nice thing to do.
That's great. Well, my wife Melanie has been reading that unpublished manuscript the last couple days and really enjoying it.
Oh, good. Well, I was going to ask you how that was going. And is she reading it on a tablet or something, or did you print it out?
I printed it out, so a lot of pages there, but I printed it out.
Paper is good. You can make notes on paper, so I can get the best ideas she's got.
There we go. Well, she's pretty good. She usually but I'll warn you, she usually marks up my manuscripts quite a bit, including my sermon manuscripts. So
yeah,
you may get it back with some red marks, but she says it's really good so far.
Okay, I'd rather hear it from her than from other people. That gives me a chance to improve it.
That's right. Well, Frank, we were noting the kind of in that first half of the passage where Amos sees this vision of God holding up this plumb line, and really that's reference to the systemic evils that were going on in Israel. Where do you see the instances of the parallels today where there are systemic injustices going on, where the people perhaps who are participating in the system are good, righteous, generous, spirited people, but the sinning is being done by the system?
Well, yeah, and it's more complicated than in Amos's time because he was talking to one nation. And of course, today, as everybody knows, without getting a PhD in economics, we're so globally interrelated that it's going to be a very difficult period of history to be moral in when it comes to connections and connectivity. At the first program we did a couple of weeks ago in this series, we talked about people like Facebook who are not doing much about cracking down on human trafficking, and yet we all use Facebook, even though they put themselves in a very immoral, not amoral, but immoral position. But if you really want to get complicated, if you look at the headline in the New York Times today in the Sunday paper, it's a long, incredibly insightful article on the way the Chinese government is bulldozing 250 million people's homes in China to move 250 million people, that's almost the population of the United States, from rural settings into urban settings because they want them to become consumers of electricity, appliances, and all the rest of it, because these guys right now are living self-sufficient on small farms. So exactly the thing that all the thinkers in terms of the environment are telling us all we should get back to, the Chinese government is destroying in a kind of a 60s type great leap forward, as if Mao Zedong is still around, in order to create more domestic consumption so that they can have an economy that grows even further. And we're part of that system every time we buy anything that says made in China. Now, you try to not buy something that says made in China, and these folks are buying up enormous swaths of Africa for agribusiness and all the rest. Well, guess what? We are so inextricably linked with this economy, having both borrowed money from them and corporations like Walmart basically being only in existence because of the Chinese labor they've been able to use, that, the idea of trying to do justice is going to become more and more tangled. And I think that's the reality. I also think that the idea that, people have, well, what's religion about and what kind of prophetic voice can Christians and the church and other people who are in religious leadership positions in other religions have, more than ever, what is needed is a call for morality and a standard, so that I have read other articles that talk about the fact there are maybe 350 to 400 million Christians in China. It's a very large growing movement, official and unofficial, and people basically saying that in some ways the only hope for less corruption in China, which in turn will affect us, is that you have more and more people who think seriously about religious issues in a society that has been anti-religious per se. So more than ever, I think, the voice of religion prophetically, globally, Africa, China, the United States, Europe, and so forth, becomes not just a kind of spiritual, nice thing, a cherry on top of the dessert to kind of sweeten life, but really may be the kind of moral prophetic voice that our future depends on in a literal sense. Mm-hmm. And that is, it's the last thing between us and the kind of global destruction and societal destruction worldwide is going to be a call to look at this as stewards of God's earth, look at these situations as treating other people as Jesus would treat us or we would treat Jesus. I don't think these things are academic anymore. I think they're actually a matter of survival, and really so, not hyperbole, genuinely, the survival of our species. So if there's ever been a time, I guess, globally that is similar in some way to the fix that those church leaders in Germany were in as they faced Hitler's Germany, we don't face that. But what we face is a kind of a global destruction where we have allowed our religion to be co-opted by our economic forms. And it's not just American capitalism. Now it's a sort of a Chinese government-sponsored rape the earth capitalism. These are issues that almost no one can speak to unless it is in a moral, religious voice. I don't think there's any other way to address these issues, because otherwise it's just a matter of personal opinion.
Yeah, and there was a time.
I think what you're studying in this book and in this episode is a very important thing.
Yeah, and there was a time in American history where that was a part and parcel of what Christians did, even evangelical Christians. I'm reminded of the 19th century and the Great Awakening, one of the Great Awakenings, when Charles Finney, if you got converted, you felt the Spirit in one of the camp meeting tents, you walked back and they prayed with you, and then you were given a card. You could either sign up for the abolitionist movement or the women's suffrage movement.
Right.
And it seems to me that today, really, there's a new call. We have a new Great Awakening going on, whether we realize it or not, on a very broad and deep level. And it seems to me that we kind of be needing to pass out cards myself. If I were to choose two, I would pick the environment and reconciliation, particularly reconciliation between religions. How are we going to get along together? Because now that we've democratized the instruments of mass destruction, if we can't figure out how to get along between religions, we're in for a lot of hardship. And if we can't get that...
I'd add a third one in there, too. I think that would be just as effective in a sense. I would pick the environment first, because when you take away the air you breathe and the water you drink, you're gone. So all other issues become a moot point. But for me, the second issue that I'd have a card to check on, because it's kind of a litmus test for everything. I mean, it is the great watershed, is how societies, religions, and individuals treat women. Because I think that kind of like the love your neighbor as yourself, therefore makes all the other commandments a moot point if you really take it to the serious limit. I believe that if you ask of oneself, if you're a male, or of a culture, a religion, a society, or an economic system, how does it treat women? You pretty much always get the right answer when it comes to all the other issues. Who were the people who died in that Bangladesh building? Basically illiterate and indigent women in there working for a minimum wage. What can you tell the United States military right now that's everything you need to know in terms of the success of that culture, speaking as a Marine's father? And that is the incidence of sexual harassment of women, rape, and all the rest of it is going up. And in a way, tells you everything you need to know about the price we've paid for 12 years of war. Same thing when you look at cultures, societies, and religions. Same thing when you look at workers' rights and all these other things. So if we could get that, if we could get that right, if we could say, look, pass out the card, get involved in the global environmental issues, and get involved in genuine global world rights for women. And sadly, there's an example every day. I mean, Pakistan this week, a bomb thrown into a school bus carrying women students and their teachers by people who don't want women educated. Well, that's the extreme. But on that line, I think really you get a kind of a picture of where any society or corporation is. Every time I go into a fast food joint and I see a Hispanic woman in there who's trying to learn English, working several jobs, taking my order, not getting paid much with no benefits, again, it just seems a lot of times this narrows down to how working mothers, single moms, for instance, are being treated, the lack of daycare availability in this country for people, all these other things, education for young children, Head Start, where the cuts are being made by our Congress now. It seems to me there's a lot of ways to look at this, and of course this isn't fail-safe, but one of them is how does this affect women, and you get a good answer to a lot of questions based on that.
Yeah. remember years ago, there was a sociological study in which people were asked to just simply describe the adjectives that comes to mind when you hear the word male, and people wrote down their list of adjectives, qualities that they associate with male, then qualities they associate with female, and then there was a third column, qualities they associate with simply the word human, and they compared those three categories, and they found that about 70% of the words that described male also was describing human, but very few of the features described as feminine actually made it onto the human list. It's like really eye-opening.
I know, and it's endemic, and it's not just Western society. Islam has this problem. Secular cultures have had this problem. China, that's supposed to be a communist country with women's rights. Of course, who do you think all these people who are being driven off their land are? Obviously, half of them are women, but in addition to that, the women bear the brunt because the homes are being destroyed. They have less economic mobility, et cetera, et cetera. It's just global. So, as I look at the iniquities of our global economy and what's happened to so many people, I just think that women have borne an outsized brunt of the impact of all this stuff, and it continues to go on right in our own culture. Even with as we speak. So that's one of the issues, and I think if Amos was here today, he'd be looking at a lot of things. And he would be speaking more globally because you can't afford any longer to just talk about one little tribe somewhere on the east coast of the Mediterranean. It's bigger than that. But of course, I think these things apply completely. So he could have written that yesterday.
Yeah. So one of the things that we find in that second half of that passage is that this priest objects to him proclaiming this message and wants to kick him out of the country in a sense, and says, go away. This is, how dare you preach this? This is the king's sanctuary. This is the kingdom of the king. Essentially, that is part of what you're saying. Could imply that we need to then, the nation needs to be more religious. But on the other hand, aren't there problems when religion and the government kind of come together?
Yeah, I think there are huge problems. And, the religious right that I was part of in the early 1970s up until the mid-1980s when I began to get away and distance myself from it are proof of that. And it carries into this Congress that's hamstrung the president and done so deliberately with, 85 far-right Tea Party congressmen who have really almost conspired to try to bring this presidency down. And they have not been successful at that, but they have been successful at essentially destroying the possibility of legislation on so many fronts. So, yeah, it's a problem. But I would say we do need religion involved in society, but we need it to provide an ethical platform that can be argued on a rational, non-religious basis, but that is given weight by people who believe that in arguing that they are doing the right thing, capital R, correct thing, in the eyes of God, but that what they are saying would make sense to an atheist, an agnostic, a Jew, a Muslim, a Hindu, not having to be argued on the basis of biblical Christianity, much less American evangelicalism, but nevertheless that what our faith teaches us, say about the rights of women, say about the rights of the poor, say about our obligation to the environment, that these things are true in and of themselves and can be argued from a completely secular point. But the reason that we argue them, and we have a fire in our bones to argue them, is because of what we believe. And I think there's a key point here, if I may add that, and that is there are a lot of good secular, scientific, sociological arguments for so many things that we would agree with someone from any point of view who held those positions. The question is, in their belief system, do they have a reason to sacrifice in order to see these things achieved? And that is where I think religious faith has a rather unique role. That's not to say that only religious people sacrifice for what they believe, but it is not a coincidence, speaking of the example used at the beginning, that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for instance, was willing to be martyred to try to bring down the Hitler regime, and was also a pastor and a signature of a statement. The courage that it took to make a stand in those instances, and you see the same thing against all sorts of authoritarian regimes, or even in our own country in the abolitionist movement, or the suffrage movement for that matter, I think where religion plays such a hugely useful role in shaping society, because I know we bang on it a lot, but let's say something good about it here for a minute, is it isn't that it makes the only argument for the environment or women's rights that makes sense. If it's smart, it makes a secular argument based on facts that everybody can sign up to, no matter what their belief. But the fire in our belly and the willingness to sacrifice for what we believe is right comes from a faith in a higher power that we believe we will ultimately answer to, not in some day of judgment where you go to hell if you got your theology wrong, but right here and now in this earth, where we are trying to serve what we believe is a good and gracious and loving Heavenly Father. That gives someone like you or me or other religious people an additional incentive to actually make a sacrifice that otherwise might not be there, because we wouldn't have any fixed moral point that would guide us.
Yeah.
So I think that's really where the religious input makes a difference.
Yeah, and I'd like to put in a plug too for that fire in the belly, that fire piece is one of the things that I grew up in the mainline liberal progressive sphere, and that was one of our mistakes actually when we found that the kind of the radical extreme of right-wing Christianity was really getting involved in politics and seemed to be steering the culture in one direction. We would always fight back actually using the secular language, because that's what the language you're used to speaking of in the public square. So we would cite sociological studies and statistics and all this. But what we found was that was very ineffective, because when you have people, the majority of the country is still nominally Christian. Not all of them go to church, and there are a lot of nuns and so forth. But there are a lot of people who were born and raised and still have some attachment to the Christian church, and the only people in the public square who were invoking that tradition were the extreme right radicals, and they were drawing on that tradition, and we were to just simply cite statistics and sociological studies to counter that was almost meaningless.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the reasons that you hear from people who are, for instance, in China right now, or in this country, who have been exiled or thrown out, one of their hopeful things that they talk about is the fact that there is such an underground movement of religious fervor in China from not just evangelicals, but other religions as well, filling the vacuum of state atheism that in turn has turned into nothing but corruption and greed. So it's sort of like the worst of our own corporate world, minus even a pretense of morality. Just 100% corruption from the top to the bottom, combined with an insatiable greed that makes our capitalism. Talk about having lived long enough to see something truly ironic. Look like a Sunday school picnic. Lots of China watchers, and I keep referring to it because in this case, in terms of social justice globally, this is going to be the big future, I think, are saying that, this underground movement of religious fervor and revival and interest, trying to fill this spiritual vacuum, is really where the only hope for the country lies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have anything to do with getting your heart right with Jesus. It has to do with the fact that we are spiritual creatures living in physical bodies. You take away that element, it does not work well for whatever reason. So maybe our Christian version of the reason is wrong. It's for the sake of the argument. I don't believe it is, but let's say so. Nevertheless, there's something missing to the point where you really cannot have an ethical society. And there's not one example of this being contradicted. So, for instance, when you look at Scandinavia, people say, well, it's very secular and less than 2% of people go to church. Yes, but their laws, the socialism itself, is rooted back into a social ethic that came out of a Judeo-Christian background, and then was adopted legislatively, and therefore bore the fruit of a kind of a Christian humanism that otherwise would not have existed without ethical system.
Right.
Same goes for the humanist Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So people say, well, the Enlightenment kind of overwhelmed Christianity. And I believe it's the exact opposite. The Enlightenment is a Christian heresy. It drew its ethics from Christianity, then judged the failures of the church based on the fact that Christians were not living up to their own ethical system. But the ethics did not change. So I think we've got to really start talking about ethics again in this world, and not just systems.
Right, yeah, I agree. Well, by the way, speaking of China, I want to give a shout out to our Chinese audience. We actually have a number of viewers in China, and for a number of months last year, China was trending as our number one or number two country outside the United States of Darkwood Brew viewers. So your message is being heard. And We're going to actually get back to the message with our Pneuma Divina reading. You've heard the first pass at our reading from Amos 7. We're going to now enter a period of contemplation for the next several minutes, where we simply now, we've kind of heard it from an intellectual standpoint. Now we want to let that passage just kind of soak in a bit more deeply in a more contemplative mode. We use this ancient approach called Lectio Divina, which we incorporate into our approach called Pneuma Divina, where you're going to hear now the passage read 3 more times over the course of several minutes, and I'll be giving instructions about what to, different things to do during those times you hear the passage. But this is a way of trying to let that passage sink down more deeply and then trigger insights that may come completely out of left field to you about your own life and the way we work out this faith in society today. So let's simply take a deep breath in, let it out slowly, and clear away any obstacles you may be carrying to hearing this word in Scripture. And as you hear the first pass, simply pay attention to whatever word or phrase draws your attention the most. Whatever word or phrase, and we encourage you either to close your eyes during this time, or you'll see the passage continue to cycle on the screen. Find that word or that phrase, and once you found it, think of every iteration of that word or phrase that you can find in your life.
This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go away into exile from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is a temple of the kingdom.
And the next time you hear the passage read, simply take that word or the phrase that you've been drawn to and ask yourself, what question is it posing to you at this time? What's it provoking for you in your life?
This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is the temple of the kingdom.
And during the final reading, we invite you simply to either carry on that conversation that was provoked by the reading, or simply to rest silently in God's presence with an open mind and open heart. And after the passage is read, we'll simply be merging into our musical features. So feel free to carry on that sense, that openness, the conversation, or if you care to join a conversation online about your insights, about questions provoked by this reading, we invite you to go there after the reading.
This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass them by. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Then Amaziah the priest of Bethel sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you in the very center of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from his land. And Amaziah said to Amos, O seer, go, flee away to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it's a temple of the kingdom.
Thanks, guys. Well, we want to bring back Frank Schaeffer, but before we do, I want to reiterate that that particular Phoenix affirmation that this series was really inspired by. I want to kind of bring it back to this relationship between church and state. That affirmation 7, if you'll put that back up on the screen there, I've just put it up on my screen. The Christian love of neighbor includes preserving religious freedom and the church's ability to speak prophetically to government by resisting the commingling of church and state. Oftentimes when we realize that some of those spiritual values would be helpful for changing the systems of society, religion can oftentimes fall into the trap of simply associating itself with the political establishment. That was certainly what the clergy in 2004 who helped pen the Phoenix Affirmations were responding to, was an over-easy equation of religion and state. And Frank, I know you know something about how that came about. You've talked to me before about that. I was really struck by kind of the object lesson for any of us, whatever side of the political or religious divide we may be on. What happened? How does religion and state become kind of enmeshed together in an unhelpful way?
Well, you know, you're talking about things that I've written about in my books like Crazy for God, where I chart the involvement of my family, Francis and Edith Schaeffer, who were evangelical leaders, and then myself as my dad's sidekick in the early 70s through to the mid-80s, had in the evangelical world that then jumped and went right into the heart of the American political establishment. So I think the journey our family took that I talk about in Crazy for God is really a kind of metaphor for the journey an entire body of evangelical Christians and conservative Roman Catholics took together in starting out with very sincere desire to see their moral vision when it came to issues like abortion applied to the society in general, and then beginning to use tactics that actually in the end denied our own faith. So all of a sudden, if you fast forwarded from where we began trying to save unborn children, which was our motives at the beginning, as we saw it then in the anti-abortion movement, where we wound up was, when I say we, I mean not our family, because Dad died in '84 and I got out of the movement, but where our movement wound up was literally hand in glove with the Republican Party, not as advocates standing on the side, but actually running people like Michelle Bachmann for office, and those kind of folks, Sarah Palin and others, who came at it as servants of not just corporate America, but all sorts of right-wing issues, whether it was the National Rifle Association or making things easy for the oil industry in drilling and pipelines, or trying to deregulate banking and business and allow Wall Street to do anything they wanted. The path between the far-right agenda that finally wound up where it is today now with the Republican Party, anti-immigration, anti-gay, often anti-woman, anti-choice, all these other things didn't happen overnight. What happened was while seeking for good intent to change something morally, but using the tactics of the world, of government, of politics, of whatever it takes to succeed, all of a sudden the Republican Party and the evangelicals who were trying to move it toward their position became indistinguishable. So now if you take right-wing evangelicals out of the Republican Party, there is no longer a Republican Party. They are the voting bloc that decide all the primary elections, particularly in the southern and the mountain states. How they got there is because people like me and my dad and others, as I write about in Crazy for God, incrementally bought into the lure of politics, power, access to powerful people, money, and ability to feel relevant, because I think religious people often feel as if they're on the sidelines or been sidelined. And so when you get access to the president, as our family did with people like Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. and others, and Gerald Ford, or if you suddenly see your legislative agenda becoming the legislation that's on the floor of the House, this is very heady stuff. And you forget that the prophetic call of Scripture is to be willing to be the outsider, to be Amos, who's told, don't prophesy here anymore, you're in the king's house. Get the hell out, go somewhere else. Rather, what we said was, isn't this great we're here? We'll do whatever you guys want so we can stay here and all keep having lunch and prayer breakfast and all the other rigmarole that makes you feel relevant, standing there in your three-piece suit. So the kind of what happened there in Amos that you're talking about and reading the passage was reversed. We knocked on the door, said, we want to be in the king's house, and we'll leave our Christian standards at the door here. And instead of coming in with a prophetic voice, we will come in and tell you anything you want to hear, as long as you'll pass some legislation along that meets the moral litmus test. We will overlook everything else. So I know this is very crude and generalized, but where we started out was wanting to save some fetuses, and where we wound up was saying, if you'll play the game with us and allow us to have access to power, we'll turn a blind eye while you rape the earth, turn your back on women and children, defund the education process, and build our military into a perpetual war machine globally, as long as you keep allowing us access to the power and palace so we can prophesy there. So it's just what we did is the exact reverse of what happened to Amos, who was a true prophet, actually went up against the system and was told, don't do that here anymore. Yeah. Rather, what happened to us is we knocked on the door. They said, come on in, be one of us. Just play the game, and we were all too willing to play it. So it was an incremental 30-year process. That's how we got into it.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, going back to Tex Sample's comments at the beginning of the episode, that it seems like so oftentimes, whether it be on the right or the left, when you get in bed with politics like that, what you end up doing is making God's story a subsection of a very all-too-human story,
right?
Rather than the human story as a subsection of God's story.
Right, exactly. And it happens with establishments. I mean, if you look at the way the Roman Catholic bishops have been protecting their own backsides when it comes to all the malfeasance that's gone on in the Roman Catholic Church, protecting the institution rather than the people, or when you look at the evangelical establishment, which is made up of millions of men and women who are very good-hearted and sincere, but being led by people who have grave doubts about some of their agenda, but who won't speak up because that's where their paycheck is. It doesn't just play out in the halls of power of Washington and state capitals. It plays out within the establishments of our own religious institutions, which is the first place where the compromises are made. So, people talk about making compromises with Washington. Well, what about making compromises with the Roman Catholic bishops so you can remain in the church, or the Southern Baptist Convention, or for that matter, I'll bet you in liberal denominations as well, where you're playing the corporate game within the organization to stay in the good books of the people who control one's paycheck or livelihood, in the case of, say, a person like me who's an author, even though I'm independently employed, or rather unemployed, as the case may be. So I don't think it's limited to evangelicals. I don't think it's limited to the far right or the left. I just think it's a human thing that we all too often play the game, leave our conscience aside because we don't want to rock the boat because we depend on it. And that's where it starts. Whereas Amos is an example of someone said, I don't care if I get tossed out or killed. I'm still going to tell it as I see it.
Yeah, we can use a few more people like that these days. Well, Chris has been waiting. She's got some feedback from the internet she wants to share.
Speaking of making compromises in the church, there was a conversation that one of our viewers had today. I think it's Prairie Stewart. Said, I had a great lunch today with the Episcopal Bishop of the Indigenous people of Canada. He tells me that church as it is today has absolutely nothing to say to poor people. The church only makes sense to people who have money. That was an interesting comment, I thought. There's also somebody online saying, how do I reconcile having to shop at Walmart when there is nothing else I can afford? Plus, the Walmart people don't look down on you when you use food stamps. So we've got a poor person who's using food stamps and trying to use the system in the best way possible to continue just a basic lifestyle. And we have the church people saying of themselves that they don't really have much to say to the poor in this issue. What do we do with all that?
Well, I have a few comments. One is that things don't change because people make a moral statement or buy this pair of shoes or that pair of socks or another. I think in the end we have to offer an alternative. And I know this sounds a little artsy-fartsy, but it's got to come back to beauty. And so, one of the things we need to do when it comes to children and when it comes to churches, when it comes to relationships, is reintroduce a hierarchy of priorities which isn't matched, which is not only measured in these material terms. And so the problem is not someone shopping at Walmart. The problem is that we keep settling for a common denominator that just lowers all the time. It's the fact that, not only do we have to ask Walmart to pay fair wages, we have to start looking at a society that puts so much of a premium on business success that we make heroes out of people like the family that owns Walmart or the Koch brothers or the oil industry or the people running Google, as if somehow the higher aspiration in life is the economic ladder. And so when we stop paying so much attention to material prosperity and we start looking rather at the content of our own character or the content of the character of those around us and in our culture, the problem is not going to be solved by boycotting this or that store. I think the problem is solved when we look at the entire kind of aspirations of our culture that is always measured in terms of success or education. People are always busy telling you, about how much they make or what they've got or what they do or where they went to school or what they drive, the kind of houses we own. When those are no longer the priorities, then we're not going to fall into the trap that we were talking about earlier, where all of a sudden China is bulldozing all these peasant villages and communities that have been self-sustaining for 2,000, 3,000 years, literally, and instead forcing them all into high-rise apartments to become consumers because they're looking at us on YouTube and Facebook and they want what we've got because that's been held up as a standard of achievement rather than asking real questions like, does this grandchild have a grandmother who loves her and cares for her and is someone she can trust and go to? Is this a good father? Not does he use food stamps or not? Who are we? The entire edifice of our kind of commercial prosperity gospel has to be swept away and replaced with something about content of character. And so a country like China is measured on the kind of people that it produces in their relationships, and a country like America the same. This is what I think people need to be called to, and that is really the revolutionary kind of leveler when it comes to this stuff. So I don't think we have to worry about whether we're buying our shoes at Walmart. What we've got to worry about is an premium getting a bargain because we're trying to keep a certain standard of life that, places like Walmart keep popping up because we're always looking for the best deal and the consequences. And the reason is because we want all this stuff. Yeah. So, the problem with Walmart is not Walmart. It's a society that has people waiting in line at 2 a.m. on Black Friday so they can crash the doors and get 20% off a widescreen television. That's the mentality that's creating our problem. It's the material quest for prosperity rather than character development.
Frank, and we're going to have to call this episode to a close for now, but we'll look forward to hearing more on that line next week. So thanks for joining us, Frank.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a
lot. Every week we really conclude the episode with sharing a common meal in communion. If you happen to be online and have bread and crackers or juice and wine, bread and wine, juice and crackers, or whatever fare you may have, would like to join us with this meal, we encourage and invite you wholeheartedly to do so. I'm reminded, kind of taking in this whole episode and what's been said, I'm reminded of a proposal that a theologian named Stanley Hauerwas once kind of wafted into the ether that was highly controversial when he was really trying to deal with the systemic evil of warfare and said, I've just got a modest proposal. How about the Christians of the world just agree that they will stop killing each other? Okay. Now, people all got reacted like, well, does that mean that Christians could kill Jews or or whatever? Like, well, that wasn't his point. His point was like, if you could actually convince, like, that if everyone who was Christian agreed that they would not kill each other, that might start something quite big. And when I think about all the systems that we're a part of and how complicated it gets and how hard it is to change at those broader levels, I kind of want to make a similar proposition among Christian churches, that instead of working to make the nation more Christian, we devoted ourselves wholeheartedly to making the church more Christian, to creating a community that is so utterly loving and caring of each other that it creates a magnetic draw for others. And yet, as more come, the more they become into the fold of loving and caring and learning what it means to be a new creation, a new community, a new society. If we could devote ourselves wholeheartedly, for instance, to finding that which brings us most fully alive in this world, our sweet spot, our calling in life, and offering those gifts to the heart of the community, what would it mean to be really the church and to welcome the stranger, to deal with the situations of those who are economically disadvantaged, to really come around and be that community. Whatever we envision for society, we actually replicate in the church itself. I think ultimately the symbol of what that kind of church would look like comes together in this meal that we celebrate at the end of Darkwood Brew. Is a church that is not simply sitting in then the heights of society, in the catacombs of power, or the halls of power, but rather a church that is for the broken. A church that understands when blood is shed, doesn't run away from it, doesn't support systems that encourage the breaking of bodies, the shedding of bloods, but rather joins with those very people to become the community of Christ. This is the bread of life, the cup of blessing. I invite you to share it with us in the name of Christ, our peace and our wholeness. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, where we will be joined once again by author and speaker Frank Schaeffer. And just simply want to leave you with the basic question that Amos raised this evening when he spoke about God and the plumb line, that gave that vertical dimension that really, by which society and community, true community, is to be held up to. I think the basic question Amos always asks us is, whose story is the highest story? Is God simply merely, or in God's community, a mere subsection of our human story, or is our human story a part of God's dream? Until next week, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, but may become for you the very sources of life and light that you're looking for. Go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone. You are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.
Thank you.